Some of you may have heard this lecture before, some of you may not have. I'm not going to be doing a deep dive into the beat sheet this time. I'm going to be mentioning it, but I'm going to be talking about the way it interfaces with the Snowflake method and how I use those two, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about story structure too, and how those work together and how you use outline and story structure. So even if somebody's a complete pantser, this is still going to be useful for them. Which is okay, if you don't do a lot of planning, this will also work for you, even if you don't write everything down. So, yeah, it's going to be a pretty chill meeting. I'm not going to be able to see the chat for portions of it, so I'm going to have to, like, pop in and out, because for some reason, PowerPoint has decided it takes up both monitors all the time, and takes up all of both monitors all the time. I don't really have a say in that, which is extremely frustrating. So that's something I'm trying to work on. Oh, okay, there we go. And now I have it. I can present this way. Glorious. Okay. I'm still trying to figure out all the parts of this. Alright, so I guess we are going to get rolling. Hello everybody, it is nice to see you all. I haven't been back in a couple of weeks, because as I just mentioned, I'm recovering from shoulder surgery, which made it hard to type, exist, do anything, what have you. So, I decided that since this is my triumphant return, I would do a more full-featured presentation this week, including the PowerPoint that you can see on the screen there. If you are not watching the stream, it is time to dive in and check it out. Nobody requested this, but I haven't done it in a while, and I recently kind of updated some of my philosophies regarding the beat sheet, which I am going to be putting forth in a blog post tomorrow. But this isn't really a deep dive into the beat sheet. It's going to be talking about outlining and story structure, and two of the methods that I think work best for that. So I am going to hop over to my PowerPoint presentation, and we are going to get started on that. Alrighty. Glorious title screen. Here we go. So the two methods we are going to be covering in this presentation are the Snowflake method and the beat sheet, both of which I use pretty extensively for the purposes of creating stories and initial concepts and ideas. So that is kind of what we're covering here, since I know that it's a really common thing. We have a bunch of new members who haven't seen this kind of stuff before, from me anyway, and I wanted to have a brief conversation about the way that this is important. And the reason that I keep bringing up the beat sheet and talk about these things so much is because of everything I have taught anybody, story structure is the most important thing I can possibly teach an author. Like, number one, if anybody ever asks me what the most important thing an author can learn is, I will say story structure 10 out of 10 times. That is it. So this is the kind of thing that I will hammer forever. So we're going to start by talking about the Snowflake method, which was created by Randy Ingermanson. I might not be pronouncing that last name correctly, and I'm sorry, Randy, if you see this and I mangled it, but doing my best. So the Snowflake method. The Snowflake method is the reason it's called the Snowflake method is because it's fractal. So it kind of grows in layers as you work on it. It's like a Fibonacci sequence. It gets bigger over time as you progress. It does not require any particular outline, so if you're a pantser and don't like to write outlines, this method will work just as well for you as it will for somebody who does write outlines. So that is something that you can be certain of. Another thing is it is also really excellent when used in conjunction with other outlining methods or story creation methods, and can be used with any structure you like, whether it's the 3-act, the 5-act, whatever it is. It works for those. So it is just kind of a general way of developing ideas before you put them on paper. Now, As I say later on, I don't use all the steps. I only use like the first 3 myself, but I'm going to mention all of them to you because there are lots of folks who are maybe not familiar with the Snowflake method and would like to learn more and might gain something out of it where there are tools in it that I just don't need. So you can use or not use most of the steps after step like 3, and that will either, like, it'll give you more or less detail in specific areas. We'll get to that though. And finally, it does help you kind of put your story together before you start writing, which prevents authors from getting stuck partway through. Most of the time I ever hear an author talking about how they have gotten stuck in their manuscript partway through, particularly pantsers, is because they don't know what their end goal is, and so they're just kind of writing whatever comes to mind rather than having a destination. So if I left my house and just started driving with no destination, I would eventually be like, where the crap am I going? I'm now out of gas, and I haven't gotten anywhere. I just went that way for 3 hours and haven't accomplished much. So this is kind of helping break through that barrier and prevent that sort of problem from happening in the first place, which is all we can ask for. So this is the Snowflake method. There are 10 steps, and conveniently I managed to fit 5 on each of the slides. So there we go. It starts by writing a single sentence summary of your idea. The original creator suggests 15 words or less, and I just noticed there's no period at the end of that sentence, and I used periods on all the others. Now I'm mad at myself. Anyway, so you write a sentence describing your idea. It could be anything from, to describe my cyberpunk novel, a low-level police officer stumbles into something by mistake and ends up in a problem he should never have been a part of. It can be that simple. Don't worry about character names at this point. Don't worry about anything other than rough concept. So, write yourself a sentence. The original author suggests taking a few hours to do this. It took me like a minute and a half. So it might take you more or less time. The amount of time the original creator suggests is not helpful. Yes, horny squirrel goes brr. Sure. But the point of this is to kind of have a general idea of where your story is going to start and end. Then the second step is you expand that sentence into a paragraph. Again, the original creator suggests 5 sentences for this paragraph. And they tell you to go over the 4 major disasters and the ending. I am inclined to recommend 3 major disasters, 1 per act. And if you want to do opening and closing as separate, that could fit in the 5-act. The original author didn't really talk about story structure in this. They're just talking about how to generate ideas. So you could have more than 3 disasters per book. You could have 4. You could have 12. It makes no difference in some ways. But make sure that you kind of plan out the big points. The reason this is mentioned, it doesn't have to be just a disaster. You're looking for major story elements. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about that when we start talking about the beat sheet, but I'm just going over what the Snowflake method suggests. Step 3 is describing the main character and what their arc is, who they are when they start, who you'd like them to be when they end. This is a vitally important part that a lot of writers skip. They like to, I will get to what disasters are in a second. They like to talk about their main character, but they don't really talk about the main character's journey when they are discussing the story. They just talk about who the main character is, not who they're starting as versus who they're ending as. And these main character's arc is a massive part of your story, and you should not skimp on that. To circle back around, what are disasters? The original creator is not clear on what constitutes a disaster. I am guessing that they are saying 3 major setbacks or things that happen. I'm going to explain that a little more in depth when we get to the beat sheet because, for example, the catalyst would be considered a disaster. The midpoint could be considered a disaster, and then you have the finale, which could be considered a disaster. But I will explain more. And if I don't this time because I run out of time, I will explain more soon. Or I will explain more in chat and tell you what it is. So write a 1-page synopsis expanding your paragraph from step 2. So step 2, It's that 5-sentence paragraph. You're going to expand that into a 1-page paragraph, and that horrible typo that is going to haunt me for the rest of my life is an example of the fact that proofreading is important. Then step 5, you're writing a description, and a 1-page description, according to the original author, of each major character, and a half-page description of every minor but important character. I think 1-page description is a little excessive, but so I'm not going to be sticky about the length of things here. Like, for example, he suggests a 1-page synopsis. I don't know that 1 page is entirely necessary, but I get that he's kind of like trying to expand the story out. So I understand what he's doing. It's just not exactly what I'd suggest. Oh, look, my OBS is not continuing to keep up with my talk here. That's excellent. Let's see if this... No, that's not it. That's not it. Fun! It's not going to keep up with this, so I'm going to have to put that in afterwards. We'll just do that in post. We'll just do it in post. That's fine. Everything's fine. This is perfect. Okay, so next you have the step 6, which is expanding the synopsis to a 4-page synopsis to look at the high-level logic of your story. Again, I feel like this may be excessive, and this kind of gets into why I stop after step 3, personally. But a 4-page synopsis of your story, probably going to be more than you need. But what the original creator is trying to do is to get you to look at the big picture here and look at the full arc of your story. Then step 7, expand your character descriptions into full character profiles. I feel like if you have written a 1-page description of your character, that counts as a character profile, because I don't know how you're going to describe somebody for a page and not have it be a character profile. But it is what it is. Number 8, they suggest creating a spreadsheet with a list of all the scenes in the novel. I kind of balked at this one because I don't really like the idea of writing my book before I write my book, and I don't schedule all of my scenes before I write them, because at that point, with my ADHD, I'm no longer interested in the book if I'm trying to write every single scene of the novel before I have written every single scene of the novel, and it just sucks all the fun out of it for me, and that's where I stop, so I don't do that. Step 9, which the original creator lists as optional at this point, is write a narrative description of the story and write descriptions of all the scenes in the novel. Again, I feel like that's not really helpful to me. It might be really useful for some people, but I don't feel like it's really good for me. And then 10 is write the first draft, which is fine. So that is the full Snowflake method. Yeah, Aurora, I do the same thing. I only do up to step 3 because I feel like doing the full 10 steps of this is excessive for what I need, but the first 3 steps are pretty excellent in a kind of idea generation and storycraft kind of method of putting things into my brain. So I still think it has value, even if it's not something I particularly use all of. But I did want to present it in its entirety for folks who may or may not have ever seen it before. Because I have encountered a lot of writers, particularly those who went to college around the same time I did or earlier, when the Snowflake method didn't even exist. And when I say Snowflake method, they kind of give me a, sort of look. So that's a quick and dirty run through the Snowflake method. It is a very common story generation technique, and it works very well for a lot of people, so there's no one-size-fits-all. You can use all the steps, you can use none of the steps, you can use, like I do and like Aurora does, the first 3 steps, just to kind of get your idea into existence. That's fine too. And here we have my summation of how I use it. Again, I use like for steps 1 and 2, sometimes steps 3 maybe. And then I kind of have done the bulk of what I need to do with the Snowflake method and start moving over to the beat sheet to lay it all out, which is really where I find the powerhouse happens. I like the Snowflake method for creating the rough outlines and shape of my story. Like, here's the beginning, here's the end, here's some idea of what might happen in the middle, and then moving over and plotting it out for sure elsewhere. The pantsers in the group doing the first 3 steps in order to really create a good, solid character arc might be beneficial for you. For me, I do steps 1 and 2, sometimes 3, but mostly steps 1 and 2, because when I start writing a novel, the first thing that usually comes to me is a character. Like, those just right into my brain. Likely because I have spent so many years playing tabletop role-playing games that characters are just kind of the thing that comes to me first. Plots, afterwards, but characters, they appear, and it's like, I want to do something with this character. This character's super cool. And then I come up with a story to stick them into. So, creating a gigantic character plan after I've created my plot doesn't usually jive with how I do things. So, getting into the beat sheet, which I have talked about ad nauseum with most of you folks, but we're going to go through it again for anybody who hasn't heard it before. The beat sheet, created by the screenplay writer Blake Snyder, is, in my mind, the best outlining method and method of explaining and understanding story structure I have ever come across. I will never stop screaming about it from the rooftops. So even if you do not use it, you should understand it. So, why is the beat sheet important, and why do I talk about it so much? I'm going to start with the fact that it is descriptive, which means each beat, the name of each beat, tells you more or less what that is. Like, when I first encountered it, I looked at the names of the beats and I was like, light bulb, it makes perfect sense to me. I understand what all of these points are. I didn't even need to read the descriptions for it to work for me. Of course, by that time, I'd been in college for writing. I'd been an editor for a long time, so the light bulb came on for me really quickly because I already had a huge foundation in studying the craft of writing. However, it is pretty explanatory. The structure it creates is a universal and very easily recognized structure. We have been using this structure for millennia, and it is really easy to recognize. And it helps put into words that pattern, which we're going to get into. It is flexible enough to allow for multiple different storytelling styles. While yes, it does kind of lean on the 3-act structure by the terminology like break into 2, break into 3. It talks about the first, second, and third acts. It does work with the 5-act structure. All you have to do is kind of, basically the 5-act structure takes Act 2 of the beat sheet, more or less, and splits it in half at the midpoint, and there you have the 5-act structure. That is more or less how you would do it. It is almost exact. So whether you use 3, whether you use 5, it doesn't matter. It will fit. It provides the shape of a story without telling you what kind of content you have to have. So again, this kind of describes the shape of rising and falling action through the story without telling you what your story has to be. And we're going to get a little into that as we describe the beats. It works with every single genre I have encountered. There are some adaptations. For example, somebody created a beat sheet that is unique to romance, but it isn't so much that it changes the beats, it just changes the description of the beats to help romance authors connect more with, this is the point in the story when XYZ thing should happen, and putting it in terms that are specific to the romance genre. However, the beat sheet is more or less the same. It's just a little bit of the description has changed. And this rising and falling tension pattern remains the same universally, no matter what genre you're playing in. The beat sheet is also excellent because it doesn't require a huge amount of study. For myself, and I sort of feel bad about this, but I didn't buy the book Save the Cat. I haven't read Save the Cat Writes a Novel. I've read none of the Save the Cat books. Again, because I came across this when I was well past the early conceptual period where I was starting to learn story structure. I came across the beat sheet as a blog post that an overview that somebody else had done, and it made sense with me. I looked up the website and I followed some of the articles on there, and it makes perfect sense to me. However, I do advise folks buy Save the Cat if they would like to understand more of story structure. It is excellent. So that is a very, very good thing to know. And it doesn't require a huge amount of study in order to implement it, which is nice because not everybody has... Oh my goodness, is it not showing all of my slides in the workshop either? Ugh. Why is it like this? I'm really frustrated. So that's great. All of the slides will be available. I will share a PDF so that folks can download them. Let me see if sharing my screen is more effective than just sharing a window. Hold on, please. I'm so sorry. I'm really annoyed at the way that happened. Yeah. It's... So apparently PowerPoint doesn't count as showing... there we go. It doesn't count as showing a window, you have to show the screen. So let me change over from window. Let me fix something in my program. I apologize. I'm really annoyed. Display capture. I didn't realize that it would be doing that to me. How dare it? There we go. Okay. So we're just gonna do that, and I will fix this in post. So there we go. Here is the overview for the beat sheet. I will, as I said, provide you a downloadable PDF with all of the slides that apparently nobody got to see. I promise they exist. I am very grumpy. Anyhow, so with the, on the last point of the beat sheet, unlike the Snowflake method, which we just discussed, as great as the Snowflake method is, for some folks, it feels like I have to write the novel before writing the novel if I use all of the steps of the Snowflake method, which isn't really how I write and process things. The beat sheet doesn't require that, which is an extra bonus for folks with ADHD or who are not neurotypical, who feel like the minute they start writing down what their story is going to be, it sucks all the joy out of the story. The beat sheet is best used for novel-length works, so it may not work for a short story because it does require more space. You could probably condense it a lot and make it work for a short story in concept, but it's not ideal for that function. So, without further ado, we have the beats. Here is a list of all the beats along with the author's website, savethecat.com. The beats are in order: the opening image, the setup, the theme stated, the catalyst, the debate, break into two, which is Act 2, the B story, promise of the premise, also known as fun and games, the midpoint, bad guys close in, all is lost, dark night of the soul, break into 3, which is Act 3 of the 3-act structure, the finale, and the final image. There are 15 beats in total, and whether you want to use the 3-act structure or the 5-act structure, it does work with both despite the language. So, expanding on the beats, I put together a set of slides here with just a brief explanation of what each beat entails. So, we're going to go through those, and I'm going to do this relatively quickly. If you would like a much more in-depth dive into the beat sheet, I will be sharing my blog post that's coming out Monday that will explain this in much more detail. But since I only have an hour and the beat sheet is big, and I was doing more than just the beat sheet, I'm keeping it simple. So the opening image, the first beat you want to hit in your novel is initial contact with the story. This is going to be a more or less, here's a snapshot of the world as it is right now. The setup, you are describing the world and the characters before the events of the story happen. This is seeing Luke on Tatooine with his aunt and uncle complaining about how he wants to go to Tashi Station for power converters. Step 3 is, the third beat is the theme stated. This is the introduction of story themes that are going to be used through the whole book. I could do an entire lecture on theme, but we're not going to get into that too deep right now. Just know that this is a beat, and it is an important one. Step 4 is the catalyst. This is the moment when the characters are introduced to the plot. This is going to change their entire world, turn it upside down. This would be, for example, when continuing with the Star Wars, when Owen and Beru are killed and Luke has to leave Tatooine in the care of Ben Kenobi, who he has just barely met. You have the debate, which is that moment when the character's like, ooh, do I really want to do this? Can I do this? Should I do this? The debate is going to end when either the character chooses to engage with the elements of the story, or when the world decides for them that they are doing this. So, more or less, Luke Skywalker's debate ended when he arrives and finds Owen and Beru have been killed by the Empire. He no longer has a choice in whether or not he works with crazy old Ben Kenobi out in the desert, because if he stays there, the Empire is going to kill him. And at that point, there's no more debate, because he can't deal with, there's no more internal conflict. There is just, we have to get out of here. At that point, you hit break into Act 2, which is where the characters are now choosing to engage with the catalyst or are forced to react, and the story really kicks off. I know I did this in light speed, so if anybody has any questions, please mention them in the group chat, and I will gladly explain in more depth if I have time at the end. The next set of beats, we have the B story, which is oftentimes the romance story, if there's gonna be one, or a secondary story that is emerging here. You want to set this up early because you need to give it room to grow. This B story is typically a B story just for this book. It's not a B story for an entire series. You can certainly introduce that here as well, though, but recognize that it may need resolution toward the end of the story somehow. Number 8 is Promise of the Premise, also known as Fun and Games. This is the part of the story where it's the fulfillment end of things. So it is the part where, you know, the fantasy character is learning to use their magic, or the spy is doing spy stuff and sneaking around facilities and gathering information and all this kind of neat stuff. It is the portion of the story where the main characters are going to be really kind of fulfilling that premise that we expected. I mean, it again, to go back to Star Wars, because I am a Star Wars nerd, Luke is training with Ben while they prepare to go and try and maybe confront the Empire or avoid the Empire. They're kind of, you know, this is the fun sort part of the story, you know, and they're dealing with that giant worm that tries to eat them on that asteroid, things like that. Like, it's fun and games part of the story. The midpoint is the peak tension in the story, and I put that in bold, which you may or may not be able to see, but it is peak tension. At this point in the story, the tension is going to be the highest that it is in the entire story. Those of you who have studied writing and are familiar with Freytag's pyramid, the peak of that is the midpoint here. While I don't ascribe to Freytag's method, I actually do have a changed graph a little bit later that shows the rise and fall of tension through a story. It is similar in pretty much every shape and structure you're going to see. The midpoint is where tension is at its highest. This means that everything is either great and about to completely fall apart, or everything is horrible and has to be put back together. Those are the two options at this point. And if it is not one of those, you're not doing your readers a service by keeping the tension lower. The midpoint is going to be the point where you're really starting to turn the thumb screws and things are about to really change. Because once you leave the midpoint, you have the really dark part of the story. So after the midpoint, the bad guys close in is the next beat. The antagonist upsets the apple cart at the midpoint, breaking the surface tension and plunging the characters into the tumultuous portion of the book. This means that the spy has stolen the information that he really needs in order to finish his mission, and he's trying to escape the facility, but the bad guys are literally closing in. Or it could be the fantasy characters have a plan to stop the bad king. Yeah, so if we're looking at that, absolutely is part of it. Lead, you are correct. Each of the individual Star Wars movies can be charted on the beat sheet individually, but the series as a whole, or at least each individual trilogy, because the trilogies cannot be overall charted on the beat sheet, because I'm just not gonna get into that. But the original trilogy can be charted on the beat sheet as a cohesive unit as well. But that is also part of the power of the beat sheet, is that it can be used to describe meta plots through entire series. It can be used to describe meta plots for individual books. But yes, so we have the bad guys closing in at this point, and after the bad guys close in, there's going to be a point called All is Lost. That is the moment when the spy gets captured with the information. The bad guys have him, everything's crashing down, everything's gone wrong, and it feels like the end of the world has come for these characters. Continuing that, then you have the Dark Night of the Soul, in which characters have to confront problems in themselves or in their situation. After the spy is caught, the enemy is going to try and get information out of them. Like, really, this is a very dark point in the book, and it should be the point at which hope is pretty much gone in the story. It should feel like the main characters are never going to achieve their goals, the bad guys are going to win. Or in a romance, maybe it feels like the main characters are never going to get together. They're not going to be able to, that relationship's just not going to work. And they're going to have to come back from that, which is where we get Break into 3, which in the my brain just stopped and my mouth got ahead of it. In the 3-act structure is the 3rd act. The Break into 3 is when a new idea or solution or fresh perspective appears and allows the characters to move forward with the story. This could be Han Solo deciding, you know what, maybe I don't want to abandon the rebellion, and he turns around and comes back to fight the Empire and makes a big difference in the fight. Or it could be the big moment when the characters rally right before the end. It could be the elves showing up in The Hobbit in one of the big final battles against Smaug. It's that moment when you have, or Smaug, I guess, is how they pronounced it in the movies. I don't know if it's Smaug or Smaug. I prefer Smaug. But anyhow, it's that moment when all of that tension and all of that negativity and that darkness breaks and hope re-enters the story. Even if it's just a crack, that is the moment when hope comes back to the story. And of course, at that point, with this new perspective, with that hope, yes, I know it's written S-M-A-U-G, but how does one pronounce that? Smog or Smaug? I like the first one. Anyway, the finale is the big payoff. That is the moment when the characters, they pull off the heist. They defeat the enemy. This is the big climactic moment. Now, in a story where tragedy happens, the finale is still going to be the same, is going to be that penultimate conflict with the antagonist somehow. It's just not going to be happy in the end. However, if you are writing that kind of story, even if it doesn't have a happy ending, the ending should feel satisfying, even if it's sad. I'm going to say that again. The ending needs to be satisfying. It doesn't need to be happy, but it does need to close off the threads in a way a reader's going to be like, yeah, I can understand that. It stinks. My favorite character died. I'm sad about this, but there really wasn't another way this should have ended, and it makes sense to me. So make sure that your ending, even if you don't go with happy ending and triumph, is fulfilling somehow. And then finally, we have the closing image, which is the opposite of the opening image and should show how the characters have changed through the course of the story. Remember me mentioning to you that characters need to have a progression and need to have a shape to the story. This is a reflection of that. There needs to be a shape. And that opening and closing image shows how the characters have changed through the course of the story. And if your characters have not changed somehow through the course of the story, like other things, you are doing your readers and yourself a disservice. Your characters need to have grown somehow. Part of the reason I harp on this so hard is because when I was younger, or in certain TV shows, etc., there are trends of characters never growing. They never change. Like a lot of sitcoms do this. Characters don't tend to grow or change a great deal very much. It's just you go through the shape of the story, you get some laughs, the end is kind of the contrast to the beginning, and the characters don't grow. But there is a change, sort of, in the situation. I believe firmly that if there's no character development, that a story is pretty much worthless. It's sort of like having nothing but cake frosting. Like, I enjoy cake frosting, but if I have nothing but cake frosting, what am I doing with my life? I mean, don't get me wrong, I've had days where you're gonna eat chocolate frosting right from the container, and you're going to just, that's how things are going to be that day. But it shouldn't be the average situation. It shouldn't be your gold standard for a meal, alright? I'm not gonna judge you for eating cake frosting straight out of the container, but if that's what you're gonna be doing all day, every day, please rethink your life decisions. That's all I'm gonna say. Finally, we come to the shape of the story that I promised you. Now, I am really, yes, look, let's not talk about the younglings, okay? I'm still salty about that. This is my shape of a story graph that I am ludicrously proud of and shared yesterday, I think, after I'd made it. I'm not ludicrously proud of it because the shape is super unique. I'm ludicrously proud of it because I have never made a graph before using an art program, and I think that this came out really good, and it looks pretty, so I'm proud of it. But if you look at my graph here, you will see not all of the beats are plotted out. I didn't have enough physical space to do that. And not every beat appreciably changes the tension, like the opening image and the opening scene, you know, the theme stated, all of those pieces, they're not really going to change the tension level because you're just kind of opening and unfolding the story a little bit for the readers the very first time they encounter this. So removing some of those beats didn't feel like it was going to damage the overall shape of the structure. But if you look at that structure, you will see the midpoint is the point of most tension. The finale is a little under the midpoint, but it is still really high tension. The enemies close in is a little lower until all is lost, because you jack up the tension, because the enemies closing in is very tense, but it's not as tense as the moment when, in fact, everything does come apart. You're kind of anticipating it, but it isn't quite coming apart. Break into 3, the tension is lower because the characters have an idea and hope has come back, so the tension goes down, and then of course the finale, the tension comes back up because you should be having the readers on the edge of their seats at least a little bit. Because they shouldn't necessarily know for certain whether or not the finale is going to be good or bad. I mean, yes, in certain genres, like a romance novel, you know you're going to get that happily ever after, but it shouldn't feel like that's a done deal until the very end. So that is a thing. And so in a lot of writing classes, you are going to see something called, I think, Freytag's pyramid. It is a literal, just triangle shape that shows that tension should rise to the middle and drop to the end, and that's it. And I disagree with that, because as you can see on this handy-dandy little graph, I don't believe that it is just a straight up and straight down sort of situation. You have kind of a push-me-pull-you, a rise and release of tension on and off through the whole story that carries you right down to the end, where tension should be the same as it was at the beginning, more or less. Now, this does not include things like cliffhanger endings, because I really don't like those. I don't typically believe in using them. I don't typically think they are a good thing. There are occasions when they are useful in a book series. Jim Butcher has a couple of them in his entire series, but the book that was going to release that tension came out almost immediately after the first one, so it didn't keep readers on pins and needles for years upon years upon years, because there are authors who do that. They'll put out a cliffhanger ending, and then the next book doesn't come out for 5 years. Or never comes out. And I really think that is a desperate disservice to your readers. It's just mean. And eventually they're going to be like, yeah, I never found out what that was, and frankly, I don't care anymore. And they're going to go find something else to do with their time. So I don't really advocate for those, except if you're doing rapid release and have all the, like, you have the whole series written and it's just going to be out, 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 out. Yes, you can get away with that. That's not a big deal. But it isn't something you should rely on or do normally. Just, putting that out there. So, in conclusion for this whole disaster piece, the fact that there are tons of methods to write stories. There are as many methods as there are writers. None is more correct than another. They are all equally correct, because what works for you is right for you. But following the shape and pattern of rising and falling tension through a story is vital. Whatever method you use, however you come up with your story, whether you plot it out meticulously to begin with or have zero plans whatsoever, all the way through to the end, doesn't matter. The rising and falling of tension in the pattern I pointed to in the last graph, or something similar to that, because that is my personal philosophy, but there are other ideas. But that rising and falling tension pattern is going to be the thing that keeps readers reading your book. Without it, they will put it down and never come back to it. The reason that everybody's primary commentary on my book is I couldn't put this down is because I can do rising and falling tension and have my pacing really tight. And I keep turning the thumb screws through the whole story to keep the tension where it needs to be in order to keep readers wanting the next chapter, wanting that next scene. And that is the thing that is going to keep readers in your story. Now, you don't have to do it as fast-paced as I did to keep readers turning pages. You can relax a little bit more, have a bigger word count, and have these sections take longer. But that pattern needs to stay the same. It's really important. And that's a hill I will die on. Also, the beat sheet is the best story structure explanation I have ever seen. I will die on that hill. I have a lot of hills I'm going to die on today, apparently, so I should probably put on some armor or something, because... Anyway, but it is the absolute best explanation of story structure I have ever seen. If you learn nothing else from me, use the beat sheet in so much as look at the shape of the story it creates and follow that shape. Even if you don't use the beat sheet to write out all your beats, even if you prefer other methods of outlining, that's okay. But that shape of the story is going to be the thing that's going to work. And finally, the Snowflake method is an excellent way of coming up with loose ideas and putting them down on paper and preparing you to write next segments. You can use as little or as much of it as you like without losing its ability to function. So that is a fun thing. But it is an excellent way to get your brain kind of rolling and get the ideas coming. Because it is fractal, it kind of just takes, okay, here's the sentence that your story is about, and builds on it. And kind of builds on it outwards and upwards and sideways until you have an entire concept. It is a really excellent method. Just because I don't use all of it doesn't mean it's not valuable, but I think it's a really important tool to have for authors. Even, again, if you don't use that particular method, it's a good thought process to have to, like, okay, so what's my story about? Here's a sentence. And then you expand on that sentence to include the shape of the story arc. And even if you only do those first 2 steps and you want to pants the whole story and not... for anybody who doesn't know what a pantser is, there are 2 general thoughts about writing. You are either a plotter, where you write your outline and have the entire plan in advance, or you're a pantser, and you just kind of write what you feel like writing in that moment, and you might have an end goal in mind, you might have a start point in mind, but you don't necessarily. And that is the general 2 philosophies towards writing methodology. But Both are equally valuable. You can be a pantser and get value out of both of these story creation methods that I have outlined today, even if you don't write down a single word. If you internalize that structure and the shape of the story, when you write, even if you don't have a serious plan, you're going to know, okay, this is roughly what beat I'm at, so I should raise the tension accordingly, or I should have these things happen accordingly. And while some people like to hem and haw and say it's very constraining, it's not really, because it's just telling you where to ratchet up tension and where to introduce story elements. Not what those story elements are. You can create them however you like. So it isn't necessarily telling you that you need to have a romance element and it needs to be here. You need to have a moment when the characters are specifically captured by the bad guys and it must be here. No, it just kind of gives you a shape of, here are the points in the story where it should feel darker or lighter, where it should be more or less tense, and here's about the time period when you're looking at resolving some of these things or exploring some other things. And that is really where its power comes from. And it's just as valuable for someone like me who writes out every beat in advance of my story. Not all those beats stay how I wrote them out. In fact, usually they change a little, but I at least have an idea that I'm writing toward, and I can write toward each beat and put them together. And I find that really helpful. But if you aren't the type to write things out, that's fine. So, those are the two primary methods of story creation, and the ones that I think are the most useful, important, and powerful to authors. What would be the beat sheet of World War I don't know, because it's not a story. That's a completely separate thing. If I turned it into a story, I'd create it, but that's a heck of a question. So, to slip back over here to the weekly workshop screen, does anybody have any questions about what they have seen, what I have covered, or any questions about story structure in general that I have not answered? In our remaining about 10 minutes here. I'm seeing a whole lot of silence. I'm going to take that as a no. By the way, Soul, it's really nice to see you. Glad you joined us. Do you have any questions about the way you put together a story and what, like, order things go in? I know this was probably really fast and you came in the middle, so it kind of got complicated real quick, but do you have any questions? And also, it's great to have you in with us. Your silence is concerning. If anybody does not have questions, I am probably going to wrap it up just a couple minutes early here then, because I'm hungry, honestly. Lead made the mistake of mentioning chicken earlier and said that he was going to eat it before it got cold, and I got hungry, and the hunger has only progressed, so I really blame him for this. It's your fault, Lead. You know, I blame you. But thank you all for coming. I appreciate your interest in this, and please let me know if you have questions or ideas you would like to have for a future workshop, because otherwise you're going to get whatever comes to my head that week, which may or may not be something you want to learn. So if you have anything you really want to share, please tell me, and I will put together an idea. And other than the fact that it wasn't working half the time, do people like the PowerPoint presentation? Other than the fact that apparently part of the time it was not presenting live, much to my infinite fury. Wonderful, thank you. That gives me... You could see it the entire time? It was only showing the first... on my screen, it was only showing the first slide for most of it. It wasn't keeping up with the slides. Because there were a lot more slides than showed on my screen. I'm going to be providing, like I said, I have a PDF of all of the slides, so if you didn't see all of them, I'm going to be providing that to you for download. It's up on my Google Drive. So I'm going to be popping that in after we have the discussion here. And also, if you're watching this on YouTube, check the links section. It will be down in the description box, and you can download it too. I mean, that does sound very, very much World War I. So while I am a historian and I have my degree in history, I kind of stopped studying history after basically up to the start of World War I was not interested in anything post the start of World War I because the modern era and the world wars just do not do it for me. Not my thing. I was not particularly interested in it. I wanted castles and, you know, manners and all that other stuff. That's not what I wanted in the time period. Yes, historical events do not make good beat sheet references at all. So, I will leave you all, and I will see you next week, and I hope you have a great week, and take care of yourselves.